have to put them on my permit.
Yes.
Most of them are pretty tiny. 100 miles.
It just turned itself off.
Okay.
Testing.
There you go.
Testing.
And I'll turn it over.
Getting better? I have to admit, it's getting better all the time. Getting better all the time. 164. I'm 61 now.
That's the sale on that we did.
Well, thank you for coming, everyone. Can you guys hear me okay? The guy who's leaving, can you hear me okay? Lisa, can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, well, thanks for coming, and welcome to a special event, Tate Museum Lecture. Those of you who've been paying attention notice that we've been doing these in the spring for the past 3 or 4 years, with a break for COVID, of course. But I'm going to start right away by thanking the Department of Geology and Geophysics at the University of Wyoming. They were the ones who flew our speaker down to Laramie, and Laura down there emailed me and said, hey, would you guys like to have Pat speak at the Tate while he's in the state? And I said, yes, while he's in the state, speak at the Tate. So yeah, thanks for coming. Let's see, Pat Druckenmiller is right here. But wait, hold on. More opportunities.
No, I like applause. Come on.
Very good. You guys are well trained. He is the professor of geology and director of the University of Alaska Museum of the North. All of that's in Fairbanks. Pat and I go back to 97, when he was the director of the field camp at the Museum of the Rockies up at Egg Mountain. Did any of you guys ever go to Egg Mountain up there? Dwayne did. Dwayne actually went on a boating trip with Pat the year that year, wasn't it? 96, 97, whatever year it was. And but that's beside the point. Pat's been at the University of Alaska since 2007. He has been leading field trips to the North Slope of Alaska, which is what we're going to hear tonight. He's also, when I went out to visit him to do some work up there a few years ago, he also showed me on the map of Alaska other places he's been, including the, correct me if I'm wrong, Mount McKinley and some of the islands out there in the Aleutian. Denali. Thank you. I get with the program. And focusing mostly on dinosaurs. Now, when I first met Pat, he was focusing on marine reptiles, so he still does a bit of that kind of work. And one of the coolest things he showed me was a slide of a plesiosaur. Some of you guys, raise your hand if you know what a plesiosaur is. If you're not raising your hand, it looks like the Loch Ness Monster. Okay? Long neck, that's all you need to know. That a hunter had found in Montana, and it was a picture of a hunter with his gun, the great white hunter, in a ravine like this, and crossing that ravine was a concretion with neck bones sticking out. So it was a plesiosaur bridge, and it's now in Fairbanks, right?
It is. It's a Museum of the Rockies specimen, but it's at our facility.
Yeah, pretty cool. What else can I say here? He's been museum director since 2018, and I'm going to let him tell you a little bit about the museum, just because it's his job to introduce the museum, my job to introduce him. Pat, you're on.
Okay.
Oh, wait.
Thank you, JP. Yeah, great. Fun to be here. I'm really glad to be in Casper. We actually drove up from Laramie, we left this morning, my wife and I and Laura Vietti from the Geological Museum there. We drove up and took the scenic route, stopped off and looked at an ichthyosaur along the way and a bunch of great rocks. And in fact, seeing rocks is a really great thing because it's hard to find rocks sometimes in Alaska, and I'll show you exactly how so here in just a second. But let me begin by, I forgot the image check, I'm assuming that works. Yay! Let me just start by just saying that a lot of the work I'm going to tell you about tonight is a product of many years of labor by many different people, and to name sort of but a few, really. My main collaborators in this, my colleague Kevin May at the museum there, who's our operations director, who's a logistical genius and one of the great fossil collectors in Alaska, is my comrade in arms in the field. Greg Erickson at Florida State University is also one of the key players in this research work that we do, and he and I have worked hard at securing funding. But actually, we've got a couple of NSF grants to help make this project happen. And then I've got a whole bunch of fun collaborators from mostly the US and Canada, but Caleb and Don at the Tiro Museum in Alberta, Jalen Eberly, some of you might know, who's down at UC Boulder, a mammal person. Of course, we're all mammals. She studies mammals, you know what I mean. We had a bird guy, Dan Sepka, Michael Ryan, he's a ceratopsid guy. So I rely on all their expertise in order to help understand all this great stuff we have. I have a couple graduate students right now and another one from Florida State who've been involved in the digs that you'll see today, among many other graduate students. And of course I want to call a thank you to JP for having us up here. That's great, fun to be back. And a lot of the work we're doing actually is on state or federal land. And so we have great partners with both the state and the BLM. And in fact, Brent Bryhout, who's down in Laramie, actually technically works in Cheyenne, but he is actually part of his BLM region of paleontology includes Alaska. So yeah, so it covers a lot of real estate. Yeah, so I work with him as well. Okay, so that's the cast of characters. Now I mentioned rocks. I was excited to see rocks today, and that's because this is my study area. And the first question would be, where are the rocks? And I don't know if any of you have ever had a chance to fly across the Arctic tundra before. This is a view across what's called the National Petroleum Reserve Alaska. This is near Prudhoe Bay. And this is what we call the North Slope. It's flat, and it's tundra. It's very wet tundra. You can see this is not the kind of real estate you go for a hike across. You would literally disappear. And underlaying all of this tundra actually are some amazing rocks. But the only place you can really go to actually easily see them are places where large rivers have cut down through the tundra and they actually get down into the bedrock. And the best river that really does that is the largest river in northern Alaska. It's called the Colville River. And it winds its way across couple hundred miles of Arctic tundra. It drains the north side of the Brooks Range, and it cuts down through these rocks. And these are the rocks of the Prince Creek Formation that are where we do our work. And we get around. I'll tell you more about how we get around, but there's a little boat for scale right here. The rivers are our highways. Our camp, actually, there's a little camp here on this gravel bar. And actually, we usually fly into the field sites by flying planes and then landing on these gravel bars. So there's an airstrip all over there. Lots of airstrips up there, actually. So it's a very remote area, but we do need to see the rocks, and the Colville River is what gives us that opportunity. So just to give you a little Alaska reference here. So here's Fairbanks. That's where our museum is located and where I live. Here's Anchorage, southern Alaska. And you can see the distance between Anchorage and Fairbanks is considerable. That's an 8-hour drive, if you haven't done that before. Getting from Fairbanks, and that's where the highway ends. But there is a road that does go all the way up to Prudhoe Bay. And we call that the Hall Road. And that road is a 500-mile, mostly dirt road. and it services the oil fields up there. And that's usually our access to getting to the Colville involves driving that road and back, which usually is about a day and a half if you just spend all day doing that. So quite a ways up there. So the Prince Creek Formation is the name of the rocks that we're studying and that we're looking at. The Prince Creek Formation it's late Cretaceous, so it's right during that last gasp of dinosaur times. And in fact, the formation crosses over, it crosses what we call the KPG boundary, really that horrible day 66 million years ago when all the dinosaurs bit the dust. It crosses that boundary, but we've never found those exact rocks in our study site, unfortunately. They're buried in the subsurface or something. So we study rocks slightly earlier than that. Our rocks that I'm going to tell you about are about 73 million years old. So it's from the late Cretaceous. It's during a little chunk of time we call the Campanian. It's a time that many dinosaur fossils are known, especially from like Wyoming and Montana and Alberta. That's this really wonderful window of time. We have such an amazing record of dinosaurs in North America. And then we have this little really interesting story way sort of disjunct from all that in northern Alaska. And the reason we're there is thanks to this guy, oil geologist, Shell Oil. This gentleman's name is Robert Liscombe. In 1961, he was sent up to the North Slope, and he was told, go out and map the rocks. And this was before, Prudhoe Bay and all the big oil discoveries had been made on the North Slope. So he went out and was walking along the banks of the Colville River. Eventually, they became non-proprietary information, and a paleontologist looked at them and said, those aren't mammals, those are dinosaur bones. What the heck are dinosaurs doing in the Arctic? This is crazy. And eventually, that spurred a bunch of interest by our museum back in the mid-1980s. Also, we were teamed up at that time with the University of California, Berkeley, the Museum of Paleontology, and also the USGS, the Geological Survey, took the first trips in the mid-80s up to the Colville, and they fairly rapidly relocated the site that Robert Liscombe found. And there were hundreds, if not thousands, of dinosaur bones just laying out on this one stretch of river, all coming out of a layer of rock that we now call the Liscombe Bone Bed. And by the way, a little aside, the reason it's mostly called the Liscombe Bone Bed is very sadly he died the following year, 1962, while doing field work in southern Alaska. So a very tragic end, but he is remembered by having probably the single most famous bone layer, dinosaur bone bed in the Arctic anywhere in the world. It's just really cool stuff.
Patrick,
Yes?
the microphone's no longer working, so you can put it down.
Can you hear me all right if I do that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's not, okay, good. That makes it easier. Microphone's not working.
Get that dirty hat out of the way too.
Ew. To wash my hands.
Put it on my head.
So you can actually see some bones right here. If you look closely, you can see the end of a femur sticking out. There's a bone right there. There's another bone here. This bone bed layer is just chock-a-block full of bones, and they all belong to a kind of a herbivorous dinosaur, a duck-billed dinosaur. And this animal, actually, we recently named, gave it a name. We call it a Grunelig cookpicensis, and this is, I can't even say it sometimes myself. This is the reconstruction of what this animal would have looked like. It's a very close relative of Edmontosaurus, which is a very well-known duck-billed dinosaur from these parts. The name, by the way, is based on using words from Inupiaq, which is the indigenous language of the northern Alaska. And I worked with an indigenous speaker, and we sat down and we talked about the root words, and I said, well, okay, this is this plant-eating animal. It's got these really crazy teeth it uses to grind vegetation. Really fascinating animal. And so we came up with what this roughly translates to as the ancient chewer of the Colville River. So, Cookpic is the name of the Colville River in Inupiaq. So that's fun making names like that, and I do like to use names derived from local cultures, and so At any rate, that's where that came from. Now, in addition to that one kind of duck-billed dinosaur, we've actually found evidence for approximately 14 different types of dinosaurs that we now know, after 30 years of field work up there, that we think were living in what's now the Arctic of Alaska. And it's interesting that of all these different 14 species, really all but Agrudaluk and this Pachyrhinosaurus, which is what this beast is here, it's a type of a horned dinosaur, those make up like 95% of the remains we find in the formation, because they're known from 2 separate bone beds, which we've dug and dug and dug thousands of bones out. All these other species here, in fact, you'll notice we don't really know much about them. They're not named. We know very little information about most of the things living there. And the only ones shown in red, these are the 4 species that have actually been formally named. So 14 up there, probably only 4 named. We're still figuring out who's living there. A lot of really basic questions. And interestingly, about half of them by diversity are carnivores and the other half are herbivores. So it's kind of interesting when you think about that. Now the reason why we've spent, as you'll see here in a minute, a lot of time and energy and a lot of, frankly, suffering to work in this area is because polar dinosaurs are super rare. Anywhere in the world, polar dinosaurs are a real rare thing. So I'm going to say polar here, anything sort of above either the Arctic or Antarctic circles, from about 67 degrees north or south latitude to the pole itself. And in the southern hemisphere, most of what's known comes from southern Australia, because it used to be farther south and actually glued to Antarctica. So there's a site down there called Dinosaur Cove that's produced a lot of famous dinosaurs. They were polar dinosaurs. Not nearly as high latitude as stuff I'm going to tell you about. In the northern hemisphere, there are scattered sites in Arctic Canada and Russia, but the vast majority of information on polar dinosaurs in the Arctic comes from northern Alaska, from this area. So they're super rare. And really, I would argue that our site, our field study area, is really, this formation is really the most prolific polar dinosaur locality in either hemisphere. So if you want to know who is living at high latitudes, and more importantly, how these animals were living at polar latitudes, Alaska is the place to go. And it's specifically at this site. Look at that fault. Look at that beautiful fault. Okay, what do we have here? Reverse or normal?
I think you're going to point out the cute looking guy in the front row there.
Oh yeah, look at this funny hat. You see that little funny hat? He looks vaguely familiar. Yeah, I wonder who that might be, JP.
It's not a corn hat.
You'll see JP more here in a minute. So we've been working on really trying to answer a lot of really fundamental questions about this site and the dinosaurs, and not just the dinosaurs, but all the organisms that live there. And but focusing more on the dinosaur side of life, one of the big questions we have is who's there? In other words, what's the basic, who are the species that live there? Is it a lot of things, a few species? Are they the same species as that we know that lived at lower latitudes in places like Alberta and Montana? These are really basic questions, but we're still getting a handle on that. 2 questions I'm going to focus on in this talk, shown in red. Were they reproducing at high latitudes? Could they even reproduce at high latitudes? And as it turns out, that ties in intimately to this question of dinosaur migration. Did dinosaurs migrate? This has been a long-standing question for dinosaur biology for decades. And something I won't really talk about in this talk, but were they warm-blooded? And actually it does relate, I think you'll see, into some of this story as well. So let me start by saying there are 3 really big reasons also why this Prince Creek Formation is so cool. And the first reason is location, and the second reason is location, and the third reason is location. Because this area is way the heck up north. And here's the crazy part. we collect the dinosaurs today well above the Arctic Circle at about 70 degrees north latitude. Amazingly, Alaska was farther north 70 million years ago. And in fact, the estimated paleolatitude, the actual latitude at which that formation was deposited, is more like 80 to 85 degrees north latitude. It was practically at the North Pole. It was the northernmost land on planet Earth, and the dinosaurs living there were the northernmost dinosaurs that we know of that ever lived on planet Earth. Pretty cool. So the question then is like, well, okay, way up north, must have been cold. But then, you hear, well, but the Mesozoic was a lot warmer than here. So the long story short, what we call the mean annual temperature, it's an estimate of sort of an average of yearly temperatures, is about 6 degrees centigrade or about 42 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's very comparable to temperatures that you might experience if you're living today in Juneau, Alaska, which is the capital of Alaska down in the southeast panhandle. But based on some other studies that are done, it's actually possible to get a rough estimate of how warm it would have been in the summer and how cold it would have been in the winter. That's what this warm month mean temperature and cold month mean temperature is. So actually 14C is pretty darn toasty in the summer. Not bad. I take that. But look at the cold month mean temperatures. -2 centigrade, so below freezing. In other words, these dinosaurs almost certainly experienced freezing winter conditions and snow. So, your image of tropical dinosaurs, I want you to, set that aside and think about a dinosaur in a down parka walking through the snow. Because that's what they were doing. In fact, they had their own down parka, at least if they were meat eaters, because many of them are probably feathered. Okay. Now, how does that compare to lower latitude sites? And by the way, this map is from Ron Blakey. He makes these wonderful paleogeographic reconstructions of North America through geologic time. They're just amazing. And this one he actually specifically made for this study to show exactly at 72 million years ago what things would have, a good take of what things would have looked like. And I want you to point out there's a connection between Alaska and Asia. Just take note of that. So down here at low latitudes, this, what we would have called Laramidia, the western part of North America. Laramidia, where have I heard that name? Yeah, Laramidia is famous for its dinosaurs, and the Horseshoe Canyon Formation in southern Alberta is a famous place for dinosaurs. Even that was pretty far north, 58 degrees north, farther north again than today. North America has been moving south. And look at the temperatures, 12 to 20 degrees centigrade, considerably warmer than what polar dinosaurs in Alaska endured. But probably the most single important thing that influenced dinosaur paleobiology was actually light, the light regime. And what's really amazing is, what I show here is how many days of darkness there might be in a given year at a given latitude. And this could be true for either north or south latitude. So 90 degrees north, so that would be the North Pole. The Prince Creek Formation is bracketed here between about 80 and 85. And these are the sites, these are the polar dinosaur sites known elsewhere in the world. And notice in red, these are the ones from Australia. The other black sites here, these are known from North America. Prince Creek Formation is off the scale in terms of how high latitude, and particularly how many days of winter darkness. If an animal spent the winter in Alaska 72 million years ago, it would have seen 3 to 4 months of continuous winter darkness. No sunrise, no sunset, just dark. And that's hard for people to endure today, so this really begs the question, how the heck, if dinosaurs were there in the winter, how would they do that? And in fact, I'm going to tell you in a few minutes that we're pretty darn sure they were there in the winter. So, really interesting questions with that. And in fact, knowing the ancient latitude that these animals lived at, and you can actually, the paleobotanists have done a lot of cool studies on the plants from up there, and one of the neat things that you can think about then is what was kind of an average yearly life cycle like for things up there, at least for the vegetation. And what's interesting is if you've ever lived in high latitudes, you know that spring and fall are very vanishingly short. Like you get a few days of spring and a few days of fall, and otherwise it's winter or it's summer. Same thing, March probably would have been like a period of rapid green up in the Arctic, followed by a long period, a long growing season of several months. But then all of a sudden in October, there would have been leaf fall, and bam, you're back into complete winter darkness again. I'm going to actually return to this figure a little bit later and think about that with respect to what dinosaurs were doing. Now, if you're going to live that far north, and when people first found polar dinosaurs, they're like, well, this is not fitting the tropical image I'm thinking of. Maybe they were just there in the summer, and they got the heck out in the winter. So people have posited this migration hypothesis that they just, when it was winter time or before it became winter, they just got the heck out of there. No way that they could deal with it. And would have had to migrate, when you think about the distance north down just to lower latitudes, it would have been several thousand kilometers round trip to go far enough south to actually get out of those dark, cold conditions. But it's possible, right? Modern mammals make some pretty long migrations, including caribou. They make the longest migration of any living mammal. So, possible. Alternatively, they just spent the winter there and they toughed it out. So that's sort of the alternative hypothesis. They overwintered in the Arctic. They were year-round residents. And if they were year-round residents, they would have also had to reproduce in the Arctic. And so one of the questions is like, is there any evidence for dinosaurs reproducing in the Arctic at all? I mean, could they even do that if they wanted to? And really, prior to our work, there was no evidence from the Prince Creek Formation, but the next closest thing we had was a formation in what's now northeastern Russia. It's called the Coconut Formation. It's still kind of around the Arctic Circle, roughly, a little bit just above maybe, but still a fair bit warmer. And from this site, about 20 years ago, actually it was in 2009, there was some eggshell described from this formation. So, okay, dinosaur eggshell, they were nesting there, obviously. But what about another 10 degrees farther north in the Prince Creek? Well, the quick answer is they were nesting there. And in fact, what I'm going to tell you a little bit about is pretty remarkable. What we found was on the basis of tiny bones and particularly tiny, tiny teeth, we now know that not just one or two types of dinosaurs were nesting in the Arctic, but in fact, 7 different families of dinosaurs, all the major groups of dinosaurs were actually nesting in the Arctic. So this isn't like a one-off with one group. This was a thing Arctic dinosaurs did. They reproduced in the Arctic. So everything from these plant eaters like duck-billed dinosaurs, horned dinosaurs, leptoceratopsids, thescelosaurs, or cute little plant eaters, and then a variety of different meat eaters, of course. Tyrannosaurs, I think you all know, troodontids and dromaeosaurids being smaller carnivorous dinosaurs. They were all nesting there, and we know that because the evidence from these bones, and particularly from the teeth, which are really diagnostic. So the reason we sort of came about this whole study in the first place was really one of, it was sort of born out of necessity. And the simple reason was, for what I was just telling you about, is today I got to drive through Badlands again and walk across, you can actually see the rock, and it just, it's great, it's just wonderful enjoying the Badlands topography. But we haven't got that in Alaska. And we certainly don't have it in the polar areas. So what we have instead on the Colville River are these river-cut bluffs. And those bluffs are steep, and you can see there's a little cone of talus at the base of the bluff that covers a bunch of the outcrop, and then you have near vertical cliffs. Very, very difficult to actually look at the rocks to find the bones. The typical go out and prospect for dinosaur rule just doesn't apply there. It's very difficult. what we do instead is we walk these beaches, especially when the river is down, and we do kind of clamber our way up these little flat irons as best we can to look for things. But realistically, most of the sites, again, that I mentioned on the Culver River, most of the material we've collected comes from just 2 sites. So here's a map of the Colville. This is about 100 miles from Umiat all the way down to our study area there. And actually just a couple weeks ago, we finished doing this trip by boat down to our main field sites. And the 2 main bone beds that have produced the majority of dinosaur material are at the lower part of the Colville River. So there are bluffs all the way along, but for whatever reason, all the good stuff is downriver, and those 2 bone beds produce thousands of bones. But we want to know more than just like what the duck-billed dinosaur looks like and the horned dinosaur. We want to know what the whole ecosystem looked like. What were the little species? What kind of fish were living in the streams? I mean, there should be birds around. Where are the birds? What about, like, are there things like turtles and amphibians? The place to find those are these microsites. And microsites are these special little, usually thin, relatively small deposits that accumulate at the bottom of river channels. And they basically, anything that's living on that land, their teeth and their bones wash into these deposits, and they get concentrated in these river channels. And so this is a common way to look for things like mammal teeth, which are tiny, tiny, tiny little mammal teeth, and other kinds of fossils all throughout, Wyoming and Montana. This is not something new to the Prince Creek by any stretch, but they haven't been looked at much up here. The only one that had been looked at is this site called Pediomus Point, because one of the Berkeley paleontologists was way into mammals, and they found some mammal teeth in this deposit, and that's what Pediomus is, actually a kind of a little Cretaceous mammal. So that's cool. That's all very good. But they didn't really spend a lot of time looking at the other components. And so we had this one site, and it produced some interesting stuff. We've got some mammal bits out of there. We've got some small dinosaur teeth. But we knew that there had to be more of these. And in fact, we focused our attention looking for more microsites. And we had luck in finding 3 brand new sites in the last several years. One of them is called Jacob's Bed. And that Jacob, by the way, is the collection manager at the University of Colorado Boulder Museum now. He works for Jayla, my other collaborator. Another one's called Paul's Pearls. And again, here's that funny hat again. He looks familiar. I don't know. I think I've seen him before.
Isn't that Jalen in the bottom left corner?
And that's Jalen, actually, right there, yeah. So, yes. So you can see it's a lovely day on the Arctic here, a nice little snowfall. And here we are digging at this bone bed, trying to excavate out this little 2-inch thick layer that's got these amazing little bones in them. Stuff we've never seen before up there is coming out of this layer. And that's why I appreciated JP's keen eye and spotting and finding these things, because he found a lot of really cool stuff in this bed. It doesn't actually stop there, though. When we dig the little bones out, then we save all of the sediment. We take it down to the river and we wash it so we can screen the material. Look for even smaller bits that we can't easily see. And it's, until you've stood in, the edge of the Colville River in 33 degrees in a rain with the stiff wind off the Arctic Ocean, you haven't lived. This is fieldwork at its finest. Look at JP's looking really, he's like, what am I doing here? How did you talk me into this?
I'm the only one not having fun there. Oh, wait, those people are young.
Oh, that's right. You're not smiling, JP.
Ask my wife, that was a good smile.
That was a good smile. Okay.
It was.
But then we bring all that sediment back, buckets and buckets of sediment. We bring it back and we wash it some more. So it's just basically with the sand-sized fraction left of the sediment. And we pick every grain of that sediment under a microscope, looking for tiny little fossils. This has taken us years and years and years, and literally it's just like, you know, sand, 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 sand. Oh, a little bone fragment. Oh, okay, set that aside. Sand, sand, sand. And so this is what undergraduate students were invented for. Yeah, this is great. Good experience. I will also mention another bone bed that we also found. It's like a microsite, except it was a microsite on steroids. It was a microsite with all that cool little stuff, but big bones too. And a mix of all different kinds of dinosaurs. The best single bone bed we've ever found in the Arctic anywhere. Super exciting, great stuff. The problem was, it's halfway up the side of a cliff. And one thing I didn't mention earlier, this sediment, it's completely uncemented. It's not even, we call it rock, but it's not rock. It's just unconsolidated mud and sand. And the only reason why there's a cliff is because it's frozen. This is all permafrost. Permafrost is the only thing that holds this stuff together. But in the summer months, what we call the active zone of the permafrost, that's where that, you know, about a meter and a half into the hill, it melts. And it becomes really unstable. And if you're standing under or on the side of a cliff, it'll unexpectedly give way, and it'll kill you. Not only will it just crush you, it'll sweep you into a 34-degree river. It's not pleasant. It's a serious safety risk. So we tried excavating one summer up there, and then this little nose kind of came down one day a little bit, and we said, nope, not worth it. We're not doing this in the summer. Just not worth it. I like dinosaurs. Don't get me wrong. But I'm not really ready to die for them quite yet. So, what do you do? What do you do? Well, this is that layer, by the way. It's just, you can see here, it's actually, you know, it's about up to 8-10 inches thick. It's really just chock-a-block full of great stuff. So what do you do? The best site in the Arctic? Well, if you want to be there when it's not dangerous, you could go in the winter. Sure, we'll do that. Okay, so that's what we did. So we said, well, we'll go up there in the winter months. You know, now it's frozen solid. No safety risks at all. You know another great thing about winter digs in Alaska? There's no mosquitoes. There's no mud. God, this is a muddy river. Oh my gosh, you just are coated in mud day in and day out. You don't have to deal with boats, which are inherently dangerous. Instead, we use snow machines, much easier to run around on. And we don't have collapsing cliffs. Winter is actually a great time to do field work. So we decided to go up and dig that site. And we did this now 2 winters in a row. The last 2 winters we did this. I have to say it was great. It was wonderful. Here's that quarry up on the side of the hill. And so we were able to relocate the quarry. There was enough snow clear that we could see the layer. And what we did basically is the plan of attack was remove the overburden and then use a jackhammer and chainsaws to remove frozen blocks of the bone bed. And take them back to Fairbanks and clean them up in the lab. So it worked really well. I mean, it actually worked really well. So here, I'll show you some more pictures. And if you're trying to squint at the temperature, it does say 52 below right there. And my colleague Steve got up early one morning to take care of business, and we had this sitting out, and he was like, "Oh, that's pretty cool." Took a picture and went back to bed, and said, "Yeah, glad he got that picture." But I mean, you know, that was legit. That was. But it warmed up a lot during the day, so we usually got up into about the mid-minus 20s. And it feels, really, it's not that bad. It's not that bad. We did have little blizzard issues. When the wind starts blowing up there at 20 below, we had several days that were really, really challenging with wind chills down in the minus 40s, 50s. So we use these electric chainsaws with a special chain on them. It's a carbide chain. It's called a safety chain. You can cut right through the rock. Pretty cool. And you know, you're cutting through bones too, right? Because you don't know what's in there. But we remove these blocks of rock and we take them back to the lab, and there's just, as long as they're frozen, they're solid. The minute they thaw, they turn to muck and they just fall apart. So we get them back to the lab, and we immediately put a plaster jacket on them. And then they thaw, and then they dry, and then we can prep them out. And so this stuff has a lot of great stuff in it. So, what did we find? Again, our goal here is to find out all the animals in the ecosystem. So it turns out there's a lot of fish fossils in these sediments. And my colleague Don Brinkman at the Tyrrell Museum, this is what he's really been working on. These are, there's a 2 millimeter scale bar there. So we're looking at lower jaws here of little fish. And here's some vertebrae. These fish are actually pretty interesting because two of the types of fish we find up there are sturgeons. Sturgeon is probably the largest fish, you know, probably sturgeons on this size range. And even paddlefish, pretty crazy. We do find scales of paddlefish. The most common remains, though, are members of the pike group, the esoccoids, and the salmonids. So this is a grayling. So we don't find those species, but we find sort of their ancient ancestors, and most of these are just very small fish, a couple inches long. We have, like 6 or 8 new species of fish in that deposit. It's crazy. Mammals. I mentioned mammals. This is what Jalen Everly works on. Here is a mammal, typical size mammal tooth for scale. And, you know, they're exciting to find. And we found a lot of mammal teeth in that OJ-saurus bone bed, Paul's pearls, and Jacob's bed. So always exciting. We named one about 2 years ago, gave it this name Unawakomis hutchisoni. It's a marsupial. It's the northernmost marsupial that ever lived on the planet. And it lived up there under the toes of dinosaurs. We're finishing a manuscript right now on a new placental mammal, so we're placental mammals. And there's multi-tuberculates, or these funny little herbivorous mammals. They have really crazy little blade-like cheek teeth. We have 2 or 3 new species of those as well. So really cool discoveries there. Those teeth, when were originally found, were identified as shark teeth. In fact, they're bird teeth. And what we now know, in fact, is we have bird teeth and bird bones from the Arctic. These, finding bird bones anywhere in Western North America and all these dinosaur-bearing beds, extremely rare. Really rare stuff. Not only do we have some actually, these are actually beautifully preserved bird bones. But it turns out these birds, I have a master's student who's working on this right now. In all likelihood, some of these bird bones belong to what we call the crown birds. These are the modern group of birds that live on planet Earth today. So big question has always been, like, when did the modern bird groups first evolve? When did they show up in the fossil record? And for a while, people weren't sure, and only recently did somebody just find something older. Well, they found it just before the end of the big end Cretaceous extinction, around 66 million years ago. We're pretty sure we have these crown birds here. These are actually scientifically super important in understanding bird evolution. So really neat material. And we found new groups of dinosaurs. Like groups of dinosaurs, we had 35 years of digging on the Arctic. New groups of dinosaurs, bam, just show up out of the blue. This is one of them, Leptoceratopsids. This is a tooth, beautiful tooth of a group of plant-eating dinosaurs we've never found up there before. They're relatively small-bodied, so 5-6 feet long, maybe 2.5, 3 feet at the hips, and really interesting-looking animals. First time they've ever been found in the Arctic. But then, out of all that microfossil picking, we found these little bones, like really little bones. So here, to make the point, this is the head of a pin. So just think for a minute. You've got a pin in your hand. So just think about that, and think about the head of a pin. it's 1.5 millimeters across. And then imagine putting a dinosaur vertebra easily on the end of that pin. And that's the size of the bones that we're finding up there. Lots of them. There weren't just one or two. We were finding hundreds of these little tiny, what look like dinosaur baby bones. But we knew they were small. Maybe they were just a small, really small species. Small doesn't mean young necessarily, right? You got to show that they're actually from young individuals. So one of the things you can do is you can look for other features that indicate very early, what we would say, ontogenetic state, very early stages of development. One of the features is, notice how porous looking the outside of the bone texture looks? That's classic baby bone texture. And having worked for 6 years at Egg Mountain and picking up hundreds of dinosaur bones earlier in my life, I had no idea that would come back to be useful someday. But sure enough, this texture is very typical of baby bones. And moreover, we can cut those open and make thin sections. And the reason these are super porous and the reason why there's so many holes is those are vascular canals. Baby bones have huge blood supplies to grow rapidly. And so this is all very consistent with what's known from other baby bones in baby material. But baby bones aren't really informative as to whose bones they are. We can say, yeah, these look like baby dinosaurs, but who? They're so young and so small. They have no shapes that really reveal who they are. That's where the teeth come in handy, because in addition to all those bones, we found tiny, tiny, tiny teeth. So I mentioned our leptoceratopsid friend before here. So that tooth is about yay big in real life, right? So here is a baby leptoceratopsid tooth sitting on top of a pin again, and very distinctive. Very definitely a leptoceratopsid tooth. And what we do to determine how old that animal is basically we compare the teeth of our little baby dinosaurs to what is known of, whenever possible, actually embryonic remains from dinosaurs found elsewhere in the world, including in Montana and places like China. So what we did in this case with like the leptoceratopsid, we used for a comparison of a relatively close relative. This is Protoceratops. It's from Asia, from Mongolia, and it's got the same adult body size, and it has a very similar type of skull and dentition. And what I have here is a picture of a piece of a lower jaw of a Protoceratops, and this is an embryo. And how do I know it's an embryo? Because it was in an egg. There's no doubt this was an embryo. And the crown of that tooth was 2.5 millimeters across. Our teeth, for comparison size, were considerably smaller than that, 1.7 millimeters. So just on broad scaling, this is clearly not, this is a very, very young animal. And we did a similar process with all of the different species that we described up there and we were looking at. So this is, we actually have a special term for animals that have not yet hatched out of the egg, or they have just hatched out of the egg. We call those perinates. So perinatal remains. And so we're using the term perinates for our teeth because we never found eggs. You even found a scrap of eggshell in all this time up there. We just find the babies. So we call them perinates because we don't really know if they were embryos or just hatched. But they're very, very, very young. We did the same thing with our friend Pachyrhinosaurus. Same thing here. Really, really small teeth in comparison. And in fact, these are actually a little bit bigger in size. We call these young of year. These are animals that were less than a year old. So they weren't perinates, but they're slightly older. They were like hatchlings, but they were less than 1 year old. The meat eaters. Our Troodon, this really cool meat-eating dinosaur from Alaska, is known as actually being a fairly large kind of a troodontid. It's not named yet. We don't have a name for it yet. But we also found tiny little teeth of this animal just absolutely minuscule. They're really distinctive because Troodon has these really large little denticles, these little bumps on the edge of the teeth. They're really distinctive, so no controversy on that one. Even our Tyrannosaur, we have a Tyrannosaur that has been named, Nanuqsaurus. Tyrannosaurs have really crazy front teeth right up here, kind of like our incisors. They call them the premaxillary teeth. And even in the case of the Tyrannosaur, we have very tiny remains of this Tyrannosaur. Again, probably not parinates, but definitely less than 1 year of age. By the way, this tooth was discovered by one of my collaborators in the collections range one day when he pulled out a drawer too far. And the thing fell, and it caused a cascading reaction through all these shelves. And there was just bones everywhere. And he knocked on my door. Oh, Pat, we got a problem. And we went out, we picked it up. There was really no harm done, and I found this tiny little vial labeled in collections that said hadrosaur tooth. I was like, that's not a ductile dinosaur tooth. Anyway, that's where that tooth was. We had it all along. And here's the really cool thing. In addition to the true dinosaurs, we also found some really crazy bones that were unmistakably bird. The tarsometatarsus is a bone you don't find in dinosaurs. This is basically 3 bones fused together in the lower part of the foot, the sort of the arch of the foot for us, makes this distinctive tarsometatarsus. This is unmistakably a tarsometatarsus of a bird. It's a parinate. And what we realized, we have the oldest evidence for birds reproducing in the Arctic anywhere in the world. And, right now, as you look up when you walk out and see all these birds heading south, a lot of them were breeding on the North Slope of Alaska and in the Arctic of Canada, because those are great places to breed, and then they get the heck out of there. They've been doing that for 73 million years, apparently. Pretty cool. So to sum it all up, we have all these different types of baby dinosaurs, or of dinosaur groups reproducing in the Arctic. But going back to that other question I mentioned, what does this potentially say about this migration theory? And essentially, there are 3 big reasons based on these finds why we don't think dinosaurs migrated and that they were year-round residents. Reason number 1, think about how small a baby dinosaur is. Even something like a duck-billed dinosaur that's 25, 30 feet as adult, when they hatch out of the egg, they're only about that big. And even like after maybe a month of growth, they're only that big. Imagine then going on a non-stop 2,000, 3,000 kilometer hike to low latitudes. Seems kind of hard and a little far-fetched. Another thing, timing. So you've got to go a long ways if you want to cover any real estate. And when you think about the timing, if you're a dinosaur, say, reproducing in Wyoming 70 million years ago, there's no reason particularly why you couldn't have bred at any time of the year, right? I mean, we don't really know. But there's no reason they couldn't have had some of their breeding cycle through the winter. I can promise you in Alaska, these animals were not breeding or had anything reproductively going on in the winter months, because clearly for 4 months of winter darkness, you can't lay an egg and leave it out and just expect it to be okay. It'll freeze. I mean, this is not an option. And so their reproductive behaviors were really limited in time, just by virtue of the fact they lived that far north. But even more interesting on the time scale is if you've taken some really new information, it's really kind of compelling. So my colleague Greg did this study recently where they looked at determining incubation periods. How long did it take for a dinosaur to incubate an egg to the time it hatched? And the answer is, he was able to figure this out from 2 groups of dinosaurs. Protoceratops, which I mentioned earlier, close relative of our Leptoceratops, and a duck-billed dinosaur called Hypacrosaurus. And you can see here surprisingly long incubation periods. 3 months for a dinosaur that big. 3 months for its eggs to hatch, up to 6 months for a duck-billed dinosaur. They are not like birds. They are not like birds. Think about that on our time scale then. let's just assume these dinosaurs did migrate, just for argument's sake. And let's say then that they showed up on the real estate there in March, right when all that vegetation started to bloom up. And remember, at the other end of life, that in the fall, they need to get out of there no later than October. Because by then, leaves are gone, you're into winter. If you are a little leptoceratopsid, you might have been hatching your eggs out by late June, early July, which would have given you, a couple of months for development before you got into winter. But something like a duck-billed dinosaur would have been pushing its luck just to get an egg hatched before the start of winter. And clearly, there's no time, there's just not enough time for an animal to get anywhere. And I want to clarify, when I say migration, I'm talking about long distance migration. I'm not saying these dinosaurs couldn't potentially have moved over, 50 or 100 kilometers of real estate. I'm sure they did. They had to. But thousands of kilometers, I don't see how they could have done it. So the take-home message is here, it's cool that dinosaurs were nesting there, but it also helped us answer this long-standing question. These dinosaurs were year-round residents of the Arctic. And if they were year-round residents of the Arctic, how the heck did they do that? And that just spurs a whole bunch of other really interesting questions. So just to recap, basically where we're at is going back to our original questions, what dinosaurs were living up there and about the other critters. So we had 14 critters, 14 dinosaurs, a whole bunch of other things, fish, mammals, birds. I didn't mention it, we have probably the first flying reptile remains from the Arctic ever found. Cool stuff, yeah, it's good. Were they the same species at low latitude sites? No, so far, none of the species we've identified from the Arctic are the same as those even found in Alberta. They're different species. Did they reproduce at high latitudes? Oh yeah. And were they migratory or year-round residents? I think the evidence really strongly supports them being year-round residents. And I didn't really, again, talk about the warm-blooded side, but I will say if among the strategies required to live in the Arctic through the winter months, warm-bloodedness would come in really handy to live in the Arctic over a winter. We actually have some other really interesting evidence about that. It's a whole other talk, but really cool stuff. So our work continues. We're looking at the plants. We have beautiful tracks and trace fossil record up there of dinosaurs and other critters, and pterosaurs for that matter. Yeah, this question of overwintering strategies, that's really fascinating. And there's a lot of possibilities there, but more field work, more time, more cool discoveries, and we'll see what we can find. So, I believe that is it. Yes, that's my humble abode there at the museum in Fairbanks. So please come and visit if you're ever in Fairbanks. It's a lovely, lovely place to spend, any time of year really, but summer's a little warmer. So, I will end it there and happy to take questions you might have. Yes.
What clues led you to identify that one fossil has a marsupial?
Oh, he's asking what clues helped us identify the marsupial as a marsupial? Really, Jalen would better answer that question, but really, with mammals, like the teeth are like fingerprints. All those little tiny little bumps and basins, all those cusps, they all have names and they're all intensively studied. And marsupials are pretty easy to recognize on the basis of a whole suite of dental characteristics. And other skeletal characteristics too, but it just comes down to a lot of detailed tooth morphology is what the answer is. And now placental mammals look a lot alike, but they are definitely different as well. And that other group, the multituberculates, totally different. Like even I can identify those as multituberculates, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, you're talking about extended periods of darkness, which is going to affect what kind of vegetation you've got. So what are they eating?
Yeah, what are they eating up there? So the vegetation we do have at least a broad brush idea of the vegetation up there. We have, it's not a rich place for fossil plants, but it's not bad either. And the most common woody vegetation are conifers, and particularly this thing called, well, it's a group really, it's Metasequoia and Parataxodium. There's two types of coniferous, deciduous conifers. So these are like kind of like larches. They're conifers that lose their needles every winter. They're like the dawn redwood. That's Metasequoia. It's there's a living species of Metasequoia. That would have been the big tree that would have made the canopy. We have, there are broadleaf shrubs. Mostly they probably weren't the big trees. They were like shrub-sized woody vegetation. So they have nice leaf fossils from these angiosperms, flowering plants. The understory was really mostly probably the horsetail equisetum and its ancient relative, and a variety of different types of ferns, and moss as well. Those somehow constituted dinner for duck-billed dinosaurs and other kinds of critters, and potentially, you know, what amazes me is things like moose today manage to survive, you know, up north in these crazy cold conditions, and they live off of nothing all winter long. So your strategy, right? Eat all you can in the summer and slowly starve to death and hope you make it to the winter. But you do eat. You just eat, you know, really poor quality forage. You know, bark, twigs, any you know leafy vegetation that you can find. It's even been suggested that rotting wood might have been possibly edible. So,
Didn't ceratopsians eat primarily flowering plants?
well, that's a good question. I don't think it's necessarily whatever is known is probably pretty limited for a given maybe species or two, and probably based on coprolites. So I think this ceratopsians were a very diverse group. They probably ate a lot of different things. I think it'd be hard to say that they just specialized only on angiosperms.